Conducting a covert military strike so deep inside a hostile country's most protected nuclear and military infrastructure that the operation requires 16 months of satellite surveillance, 4 separate intelligence penetrations of the target's security perimeter, and the coordinated activation of 12 prepositioned sleeper assets inside the country's own Revolutionary Guard, and then having that strike not merely fail to achieve its objective, but actively strengthen the adversary's political position, harden its domestic support, provide it with an international propaganda victory it could not have manufactured through any other means, and trigger the precise chain of events that Israel's own security cabinet had spent 3 years trying to prevent. Sounds like the kind of catastrophic intelligence miscalculation that happens when the tactical brilliance of an operation runs so far ahead of its strategic logic that by the time the last bomb is landed and the last asset has gone dark, the country that conducted the strike is measurably worse off in every dimension that matters than it was the moment before the first aircraft crossed into Iranian airspace. Yet that is precisely what has happened in the 72 hours since Israel's classified strike inside Iran. A strike that the Netanyahu government authorized with the specific expectation that it would set back Iran's nuclear program by a minimum of 18 months, decapitate 2 of the Revolutionary Guard's most senior operational commanders, and deliver a blow to Tehran's strategic confidence so severe that it would shift the regional balance of power decisively in Israel's favor. Instead, it has done the opposite of every one of those things. The nuclear timeline has not been set back. The commanders who were targeted survived because the intelligence that located them was partially compromised 3 days before the strike. The regional balance has shifted, but in Tehran's direction, not Jerusalem's. And the revenge that Iran has been publicly threatening for years, the retaliation it has always promised but always deferred because the cost-benefit calculation never quite justified paying the price, has now been given a political legitimacy and a domestic mandate inside Iran that no previous Israeli action, not the 2010 Stuxnet cyber attack, not the serial assassination of Iranian nuclear scientists, not the 2021 Natanz centrifuge attack, has ever managed to create at this scale, and with this specific combination of political momentum and operational intent behind it. Israel struck, the strike backfired, and Tehran wants revenge in a way it has never previously wanted it, not as rhetoric, not as deterrence signaling, but as a genuine operational imperative whose execution is no longer a question of if, but of how and how soon. To understand why Israel's secret strike has backfired in ways that go far beyond the immediate tactical failure of the operation itself, and why the specific combination of circumstances it has created inside Iran represents a political and strategic gift to the Islamic Republic's hardline leadership, that no amount of Israeli damage control, no diplomatic circuit breaking through American channels, and no escalation management framework can fully reverse in the time available before Tehran moves from public threat to operational execution. We need to understand what Israel was trying to achieve, what Iran's internal political situation looked like before the strike, and how the specific manner in which the strike failed has transformed that internal situation from one that was constraining Tehran's capacity for large-scale retaliation into one that is actively demanding it. Israel's strike was not, despite what the initial reporting suggested, primarily a response to a specific intelligence alert about Iran's nuclear timeline. It was the product of a much longer strategic calculation inside the Israeli security cabinet about the narrowing window in which Israel could act alone against Iran's nuclear infrastructure before that infrastructure achieved a threshold of hardening, dispersal, and redundancy that would make Israeli air power insufficient to significantly damage it. The Fordow uranium enrichment facility, buried under approximately 80 meters of granite mountain in the Qom province, has been gradually expanded since 2009 into a complex capable of housing approximately 3,000 centrifuges at a depth that Israeli Air Force planners have consistently assessed as beyond the penetration capability of any non-American munition in Israel's current inventory. The Natanz facility, despite the 2021 sabotage attack that destroyed the centrifuge hall's internal power supply, has been rebuilt with a hardened underground expansion that is now assessed by Western intelligence as significantly more resilient than the facility that existed before the attack. And the dispersal of enrichment activity to smaller sites at Qom, at Levizan 3, and at the newly constructed facility near Semnan, a facility that the International Atomic Energy Agency has been requesting access to since 2023, and that Iran has consistently refused, has created a target set so distributed and so deep underground that striking it comprehensively would require the kind of sustained air campaign that only the United States Air Force possesses the munition weight and penetration capability to execute. Israel knew all of this going into the authorization decision. The strike it authorized was not the strike it wanted to conduct. It was the strike it could conduct. And the gap between those two things, between the strike that would have actually set back Iran's nuclear program and the strike that Israeli air power was capable of delivering, is the gap into which this entire strategic catastrophe has now fallen. The intelligence failure that compromised the targeting of the 2 Revolutionary Guard commanders 3 days before the strike represents a breakdown of Israeli intelligence tradecraft whose specific mechanism reveals something deeply uncomfortable about the maturity of Israeli operations inside Iran's security apparatus after more than a decade of increasingly ambitious covert action. Israel's Mossad has maintained an extraordinary record of successful operations inside Iran, from the 2018 removal of approximately 100,000 documents from the Atomic Archive in Tehran's Shorba district to the 2020 assassination of Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, Iran's most senior nuclear weapons scientist, using a remote-controlled machine gun mounted on a specially prepared vehicle that is created within the Israeli intelligence community and within the Netanyahu government that relies on that community for the confidence to authorize increasingly ambitious operations, a specific institutional confidence in Mossad's Iranian penetration that the targeting failure of the past week suggests was not matched by the actual security of the assets providing the intelligence. According to sources who spoke to the Israeli investigative outlet Haaretz and to the London-based Iran International News Service on condition of anonymity, the intelligence that placed the 2 Revolutionary Guard commanders at the targeted location in the Parchin military complex on the night of the strike was provided by an asset network whose communications security had been compromised by Iran's VAJA, the Ministry of Intelligence and Security, approximately 72 hours before the strike, through a signals intelligence operation against the encrypted satellite phone system that the asset network was using to communicate with Mossad handlers in Cyprus. VAJA did not act immediately to arrest the compromised assets or alert the targeted commanders, because acting immediately would have revealed to Israel that the communications compromise had been discovered and allowed Mossad to abort the operation. Instead, VAJA allowed the strike to proceed, minus the commanders who had been quietly relocated, and then arrested the compromised asset network in the hours after the strike, producing a propaganda display of captured Mossad agents on Iranian state television that played on a 48-hour loop and that reached every television screen, every smartphone, and every public space in a country of 88 million people with the specific force of a message that no government propaganda ministry could have manufactured. Israel tried to assassinate our generals. Israel used traitors within our own people to do it, and Israel failed. The agents are in our hands. The generals are alive. And now it is our turn. Now we must examine precisely what the strike did and did not accomplish, because the gap between what the Israeli government authorized and what the strike actually achieved is the gap that has created the specific political and strategic crisis now unfolding in Tehran, and whose dimensions explain why the revenge that Iran is planning is not the calibrated, deniable, proxy-mediated retaliation that has characterized Iranian responses to previous Israeli operations, but something qualitatively different, something whose scale and directness the Supreme Leader's Office and the Revolutionary Guard's Senior Operational Command have been discussing in the emergency sessions, that Iranian security sources have described to multiple international outlets this week, with an urgency that experienced analysts of Iranian security culture find historically unprecedented. The strike's actual physical results are sobering for any assessment of its strategic value. The Parchin military complex facility that was targeted, a building assessed by Israeli intelligence as housing a Revolutionary Guard research program for precision-guided munition components, was partially destroyed. The 2 underground storage bunkers adjacent to the targeted building were not penetrated, because the Israeli Air Force's bunker-busting munitions, the GBU-28 variants it currently fields, do not achieve reliable penetration against targets hardened to the specification of Parchin's underground infrastructure. The drone assembly facility at the eastern edge of the complex, which Israeli intelligence had identified as a secondary target, was struck by one of 4 munitions aimed at it, with 3 failing to reach the target due to engagement by Iran's Tor M1 mobile air defense systems that were operating in the Parchin perimeter in a configuration that the strike package's electronic warfare component had not fully accounted for. The overall physical damage assessment, compiled by satellite imagery analysis from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and shared with Israeli officials within 18 hours of the strike, was described in the classified report as causing significant but not decisive damage to a single secondary facility, with primary objectives unachieved. Significant but not decisive damage to a single secondary facility. Those 8 words are the entirety of what 16 months of intelligence preparation, 12 activated assets, and the political risk of a unilateral strike inside Iran without American pre-authorization has purchased for the Israeli security establishment. But here is where the strike's backfire moves from the realm of tactical failure into the realm of the strategically catastrophic, and here is where the specific danger of what is now building in Tehran is both greatest and most difficult for any external actor to manage or deflect. The political situation inside Iran before the Israeli strike was not, despite the narrative that Western media and Israeli government communications have consistently promoted, one in which the Islamic Republic was under irresistible internal pressure, in which the regime's legitimacy was collapsing, and in which the population's opposition to further military confrontation with Israel was constraining the supreme leaders and the Revolutionary Guard's options. That narrative served important purposes for both Israeli and American domestic political audiences, but it was not an accurate description of the political sociology of a country of 88 million people whose relationship with their government is complex, contested, and not reducible to the single variable of economic grievance. The Iranian population's attitude toward the Israeli military threat was, before the strike, genuinely divided. A significant fraction deeply opposed to any military confrontation that would deepen the sanctions and economic isolation that have been impoverishing Iranian families for years, and a different significant fraction that supported the regime's resistance posture, not out of loyalty to the Islamic Republic as an institution, but out of genuine nationalist anger at what a large portion of the Iranian population experiences as a decades-long campaign of external coercion, assassination, sabotage, and military threat directed at their country. Israel's strike has not merely failed to shift the balance between these two political forces inside Iran. It has collapsed it. The footage of the captured Mossad assets on state television, the footage of the destroyed facility at Parchin that Iranian state media has framed as a cowardly attack on the Iranian nation, and the specific galvanizing effect of the VAJA's success in catching the asset network and relocating the targeted commanders. All of this has produced, in the internal political landscape of Iran, something that no Iranian government in the post-revolutionary era has ever fully achieved through its own propaganda efforts. A moment of genuine cross-factional national unity around the demand for a response. The reformists who have spent years arguing that Iran's confrontation with Israel in the West is destroying the Iranian economy and the Iranian people's quality of life are not, in the immediate aftermath of this strike, arguing for restraint. They are arguing that Iran must respond. When reformists agree with hardliners about the necessity of military retaliation, the Supreme Leader's office does not face political resistance to authorizing that retaliation. It faces political demand for it. The specific shape of the revenge that Tehran is planning matters enormously for understanding the severity of the crisis now unfolding. And it matters, because the form of retaliation Iran is preparing represents a fundamental departure from the pattern of Iranian responses to Israeli actions that has characterized the previous decade, and that has formed the basis of the deterrence calculation that Israel relied on when it authorized the strike. Iran's previous retaliatory actions in response to Israeli operations, the drone and missile barrage of April 13th and 14th, 2024, which fired approximately 300 drones, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles at Israel, were designed with a specific operational logic that prioritized scale of demonstration over lethality of effect. The April 2024 barrage was coordinated in advance with American officials through Omani intermediaries, was preceded by 72 hours of public warning that allowed Israel, the United States, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia to position air defense assets, and it was composed of munitions whose flight paths were calculated to produce maximum interception rates rather than maximum target damage. The barrage killed no one in Israel. It was a political performance, calibrated to the specific audience of Iranian domestic opinion and regional allies who needed to see Iran strike Israel directly, while simultaneously calibrated to the specific international audience of American officials who needed to be reassured that Iran was not seeking a wider war. What Iranian security sources are describing in the emergency sessions that have been convening since the Israeli strike is not another April 2024. It is something whose operational characteristics are the inverse of the April 2024 performance in every meaningful respect. It is not being pre-coordinated with American officials. It is not being preceded by public warning. It is not being designed to maximize interception rates. It is being designed to penetrate Israeli air defense, to identify, through the intelligence that Iran has accumulated about the Iron Dome, the David Sling, and the Arrow 3 systems, specific operational parameters and their specific saturation thresholds, the combination of munition types, approach corridors, and simultaneous targeting density that gives actual warheads the best probability of reaching actual targets on Israeli territory and producing actual physical damage, rather than another demonstration that the Israeli government can frame as a decisive defensive victory. Iran's revenge is not a performance, it is a plan. And the difference between a performance and a plan, in the mathematics of air defense saturation, is the difference between a barrage that kills no one and a barrage that kills many. The regional dimension of what Israel's backfired strike has set in motion extends far beyond the immediate bilateral Israeli-Iranian confrontation to reshape the entire strategic landscape of the Middle East in ways that 3 years of American diplomatic effort, embodied in the Abraham Accords process the Saudi-Israeli normalization track, and the regional integration architecture that multiple American administrations have pursued as their primary Middle Eastern strategic objective cannot easily survive. Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who was within approximately 8 weeks of completing the framework agreement for normalization of relations with Israel that would have represented the most transformative geopolitical realignment in the Middle East since the 1978 Camp David Accords, received Israel's notification of the strike approximately 4 hours after it was conducted, through back channels rather than through the direct diplomatic communication that a genuine strategic partner provides to another genuine strategic partner before conducting an operation with regional implications of this magnitude. 4 hours after, not before. The message that timing sends to Riyadh is not subtle. It says that Israel regards its relationship with Saudi Arabia as important enough to notify, but not important enough to consult. It says that when Israeli security cabinet priorities conflict with Saudi diplomatic sensitivities, and a unilateral strike on Iran at the precise moment that Iran's relationship with Saudi Arabia is at its most managed in years, is exactly that conflict. The Israeli security cabinet will prioritize its own operational decision over the diplomatic consequences for its most important potential regional partner. Mohammed bin Salman is not a man who responds well to being informed rather than consulted on decisions that affect his country's security environment. The normalization timeline has been placed on hold by Riyadh in the 48 hours since the strike, a hold that Saudi officials have described privately to American intermediaries as potentially permanent depending on what Iran does next and what the regional security environment looks like in the 30 days following Tehran's retaliation. The economic dimension of the crisis that Israel's backfired strike has triggered operates simultaneously on the Israeli domestic economy, the Iranian economy, and the global energy markets that connect them both to the broader international financial system. Israeli markets opened on the morning after the strike was publicly confirmed, with the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange's TA35 index falling 4.3% in the first 30 minutes of trading, the single largest single-session decline since the October 7th attacks, as institutional investors processed the combination of the failed targeting intelligence, the captured Mossad assets, and the specific credibility of the Iranian threat posture that has emerged in the 48 hours since the strike. The Israeli shekel fell 2.1% against the US dollar, reaching its lowest point since the peak of the October 7th crisis period. The Bank of Israel's governor convened an emergency monetary policy committee consultation to assess whether emergency foreign exchange intervention was required to prevent a disorderly currency decline. Tourism, which had been recovering from the October 7th crisis period and which represents approximately 2.8% of Israeli GDP, has seen a wave of international cancellations in the 48 hours since the strike that industry analysts are comparing to the pattern of the first Gulf War in 1991. On the Iranian side, the specific effect of the strike on the domestic political consensus has temporarily suppressed the normal economic protest behavior of a population whose real wages have declined by approximately 40% in purchasing power terms since 2018, and whose unemployment rate among adults under 35 runs at approximately 28%. Populations unified by nationalist anger at external aggression do not take to the streets to protest government economic management. The strike that Israel designed to weaken the Islamic Republic has, in the short term, given the Islamic Republic an economic reprieve whose value to the regime's domestic stability is not measurable in dollar terms, but is measurable in the specific silence of streets that, in the weeks before the strike, were beginning to show the early signs of renewed protest mobilization. The human dimension of what is being planned inside Tehran's Revolutionary Guard Operational Command, the actual human cost that the retaliation, if it proceeds on the scale and with the lethality that Iranian sources describe will impose on the Israeli population, must be reckoned with alongside the strategic and political analysis, because the human dimension is where the abstract logic of deterrence and escalation becomes concrete and irreversible and impossible to process through the comfortable mechanisms of strategic calculation. The residents of Tel Aviv, Haifa, and Beersheba who go to sleep tonight in the knowledge that Iranian operational planning is underway do not experience that knowledge as a strategic variable in a geopolitical competition. They experience it as the specific personal fear of people who have lived through one catastrophic attack in October 2023 and who understand, with the particular clarity of populations that have spent their entire lives in the shadow of existential threat, what it means when a government with the resources, the motivation, and the domestic political mandate that Tehran currently possesses says it intends to cause lethal harm to the country they live in. The Israeli public is asking tonight what the security cabinet was trying to achieve, whether it had realistic grounds for believing it could achieve it, why the Mossad asset network security was not verified before the operation was authorized, and what plan exists for managing the retaliation that the operation has now made inevitable. These are not hostile questions from enemies of Israeli security. They are the questions of a democratic public trying to understand why a secret strike that was supposed to make them safer has produced a situation in which they are measurably, verifiably, and immediately less safe than they were 72 hours ago. The broader historical arc of the Israeli-Iranian confrontation that has produced this specific crisis moment deserves serious analytical attention alongside the immediate operational details, because the arc illuminates something about the specific mechanism through which covert operations between adversarial intelligence services escalate beyond the control of the governments that authorize them. Israel and Iran have been engaged in a systematic covert campaign against each other's strategic assets for more than a decade. A campaign that has involved Israeli cyber attacks against Iranian nuclear infrastructure, Israeli assassinations of Iranian nuclear scientists, Israeli sabotage of Iranian centrifuge facilities, and, on the Iranian side, attacks on Israeli diplomatic facilities, attempted assassinations of Israeli diplomats in multiple countries, and the sustained proxy war that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has conducted through Hezbollah, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and the Houthi movement against Israeli territory, Israeli citizens, and Israeli interests. This decade of covert warfare has been managed on both sides by a specific implicit understanding that the acceptable ceiling for each operation was determined by what the other side could absorb without losing the domestic political space to avoid responding at a scale that would constitute open warfare. That threshold has been crossed, not by Israel's intended military effect that, as we have established, was limited and disappointing, but by Israel's unintended political effect, the captured assets on state television, the unified domestic demand for retaliation, the Supreme Leader's office facing not the question of whether to respond, but the question of whether any response short of a genuinely lethal strike on Israeli territory will be sufficient to satisfy the domestic political mandate that the strike's aftermath has created. Israel is doing something that no amount of post-strike diplomatic management, no Prime Minister's press conference describing the operation as a decisive success, no targeted release of intelligence about the Parchin facility's activities that justified the strike's authorization can undo or conceal from the regional audiences, the international community, and the Israeli public that is watching the aftermath of an operation whose tactical execution was professional, whose strategic logic was always questionable, and whose outcome has been the precise inverse of what the Security Cabinet authorized it to achieve. It is bailing water from the flooding lower decks of a regional security situation that the backfired strike has made demonstrably and measurably worse. The failed targeting of the Revolutionary Guard commanders, the captured Mossad assets playing on loop on Iranian state television, the domestic political consensus in Tehran that has just crystallized around the demand for retaliation, the Saudi normalization timeline placed on indefinite hold, the American diplomatic channels into Iran that have been closed by Tehran in the 48 hours since the strike, and the specific military planning inside the Revolutionary Guard's operational command that is no longer constrained by the political cost-benefit calculation that has always been the primary brake on Iranian decision-making about when and how hard to hit Israel directly. All of this water is being bailed toward the luxury cabin of a press conference narrative in which the Parchin strike was a success, the intelligence failure was a manageable complication, and the regional consequences are firmly under control. But the ship of Israeli strategic position in the Middle East is not listing gently to one side from the strike. It has been holed below the waterline simultaneously in the military dimension, the intelligence dimension, the diplomatic dimension, and the regional political dimension by the specific, convergent, self-reinforcing consequences of an operation that was authorized on the assumption that tactical success was achievable and that strategic benefit would follow from it. And that has delivered instead the specific combination of tactical disappointment and strategic catastrophe that happens when the gap between the strike you want to conduct and the strike you can actually conduct is too wide to be bridged by professional execution alone. The specific intelligence tradecraft failure at the heart of this crisis requires one additional layer of examination, because it is the dimension that will most directly shape the trajectory of Israeli-Iranian relations for the decade following whatever retaliation Iran executes, and whatever Israeli response follows that retaliation. Intelligence failures of the type that compromised the Parchin operation, where an asset network's communication security was penetrated by the adversary's counterintelligence service without the running service knowing the penetration had occurred, do not happen because individual intelligence officers make careless mistakes. They happen because the adversarial relationship between two intelligence services has reached the specific phase of maturity in which the defending service has accumulated sufficient knowledge of the attacking service's tradecraft, technical systems, and operational patterns to begin anticipating and penetrating its operations before they execute. Iran's VAJA and the IRGC's intelligence branch did not randomly discover the Mossad asset network's satellite phone system. They identified it because 11 years of studying Mossad operations inside Iran has given VAJA's Technical Intelligence Division a detailed understanding of the specific satellite phone encryption systems that Mossad prefers, the specific communication protocols that Mossad-run networks use to avoid detection, and the specific behavioral patterns of Mossad assets operating inside Iran's security apparatus. The asset network that was compromised was not operating carelessly. It was operating at a level of professional tradecraft that would have been secure against any adversary that had not spent a decade specifically reverse engineering Mossad's operational methods. VAJA had spent a decade doing exactly that. The result is an Israeli intelligence service whose most experienced asset networks inside Iran are now at greater risk than at any previous point in the relationship, because the compromise of one network provides Iran's counterintelligence service with template data about Mossad's operational patterns that can be used to identify and compromise other networks operating on similar tradecraft principles. Israel is not merely dealing with the political and strategic consequences of a backfired strike. It is dealing with the beginning of a counterintelligence environment inside Iran in which its most valuable and most experienced human intelligence assets face a level of exposure that will take years of painstaking tradecraft reconstruction to reduce. Years during which the intelligence picture of Iran's nuclear and military programs that Israel depends on for its strategic decision-making will be degraded, uncertain, and unreliable in exactly the ways that matter most for the specific decisions the Israeli Security Cabinet will need to make in the period following Tehran's retaliation. The operation is over. The revenge is coming. And between those two facts, between the strike that backfired and the retaliation that is being planned, lies the most dangerous period in the history of the Israeli-Iranian confrontation since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. So we want to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Israel's secret strike inside Iran, which failed to achieve its primary targeting objectives, resulted in the capture of a Mossad asset network on Iranian state television, unified the Iranian domestic political spectrum around the demand for retaliation, and placed the Saudi normalization process on indefinite hold, represents the most consequential single intelligence and strategic miscalculation in Israeli security history, worse even than the intelligence failure of the October 6, 1973 Yom Kippur War, because this one not only failed to prevent the threat it was designed to address, but actively accelerated the sequence of events that makes an Iranian retaliatory strike on Israeli territory inevitable. And given that the revenge Iran is now planning is designed not as the April 2024 calibrated demonstration that killed no one, but as a genuinely lethal saturation barrage engineered to penetrate Israeli air defense at a density that produces actual physical damage to actual targets, has Israel's backfired strike made a major Middle East war not merely more likely, but strategically unavoidable, in a way that no diplomatic intervention, no American security guarantee, and no last-minute de-escalation mechanism can prevent within the timeline that the Revolutionary Guard's operational planning is now operating against. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. To make long journeys more enjoyable, we also welcome you to our Spotify, where we present our video content in audio format. TGN presented.